Sorry, folks, just realized the audio wasn't working. Apologize for that. All right, folks, quite a few stories to go into tonight. We're going to talk first about what's happening in Baltimore, where businesses, dozens of them, are saying they're going to start withholding taxes. And they're threatening to do so because they see the local government basically, well, having taxation without representation. They're seeing that the local government is not acting out and doing things to stop what they see as being chaos on the streets. And they're calling into question, well, what's our tax money actually being used for? It seems to be the case that pretty much the government has large amounts of taxes, and the people are not seeing those taxes actually being used for things that benefit the community as they see it, at least for business owners. Now, quite a few other stories to go into. We're going to talk also about what's happening with Black Lives Matter. You might have seen the story a while back about this, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, allegedly, credibly allegedly buying multiple mansions. And also this individual finances were being redirected for things that appeared to be going to like political finance groups tied to the tied to the Democrat Party, and also local groups tied to Chinese front organizations. Now, New York Times tried debunking that story. Their debunking of the story was kind of nonsense. Basically, they tried saying that, oh, that was one branch of this front group of the CCP, but the money was going to a different branch. But guess what? It's the same organization, the same parent company, an organization started by one of the Red Guard movements of the Chinese Communist Party here in the United States that Black Lives Matter money was apparently going to. Anyways, folks, people are now calling into question what was actually happening with their money they were giving to Black Lives Matter. Some infighting in the movement right now. It's going to be interesting to watch. Also, quite a bit going on with China right now. The United States and the UK they've created an agreement. You just had the G7 meetings. They're working on this new tax plan, right? Global corporate taxes. It seems to be the case that G7 is aligning against the Chinese Communist Party. There's some interesting things going on with Russia as well we'll go into. But when it comes to the alliance forming against the CCP, the United States and the UK are specifically forming an alliance using the same structure, same foundation as one that was used against Adolf Hitler in World War II. Now, not to see what this means, folks. We'll go into a bit of what's happening with it. But it seems to be the case that the US and the UK are positioning themselves in a way against the Chinese Communist Party, very similar, modeled actually, off of a similar alliance against the Nazis in World War II. Very telling, I think, of where things are heading with the Chinese Communist Party, and interestingly, how the U.S. is starting to regard the Chinese Communist Party. We'll go into that a bit too. Quite a bit to go into, folks. And as always, it's good to see you all here. Yeah. How you doing, all folks? So again, you have questions. Leave them in the chat. Around the halfway point, we'll jump into them. Yeah. Iris123 said, why the government pushed so hard to get the COVID vaccine? Yeah, I think a lot of people are wondering that too, especially when they're talking about punishing people for not taking the vaccine. I think actually the push to get the vaccine is actually making a lot of people who might normally get it become wary of getting it. Yeah, Prima61, how you doing? Josie Mullet, hello as well. Signy Tulipan, hi, hello. All right, folks, you're all great. Always enjoy doing these lives, folks. Again, every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday we'll do these. And folks, that said, let's jump into the first story for the night. And again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. Around the halfway point, we'll get to questions. All right, folks, first story, what's happening in Baltimore right now with the pending tax strike. Epoch Times reports around 36 businesses in Fells Point, Baltimore said in a letter that they won't pay taxes unless the city adequately deals with a surge in crime in the area that included a series of recent shootings earlier this month that left 3 people dead. Last week, 37 restaurants and small businesses sent a letter to the mayor's office stating that they would stop paying local taxes and other fees until, quote, basic and essential municipal services are restored. The letter was addressed to Democrat Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott, Baltimore State Attorney Marilyn Mosby, Democrat City Council President Nick Mosby, Democrat City Councilman Zeke Cohen, and Police Commissioner Harrison. Now, the biggest thing with this is how this will affect other areas. The biggest thing with this is whether this becomes a trend or whether they deal with it locally and prevent this from spreading. Let's go into what's happening. Now, according to local reports, in response to a recent spate of violence in the area, the Baltimore Department of Mobile Command Center, Police Department's Mobile Command Center, has set up in Fells Point for the weekend. Harrison, days after the letter was sent during a town hall, promised more officers would be deployed around the historic bar area and would be laser focused on scanning for weapons and potential incidents. Now, this is the local government's response now. So over around 36 businesses wrote this letter saying they're going to start not paying taxes unless the government starts doing something. The government immediately does this. Again, Baltimore Police Department's mobile command center, meaning they can set up mobile command centers, set up in Fells Point for the weekend where these restaurants and businesses are. And again, they deployed all around the area what they say to be laser-focused operations, scanning for weapons and potential incidents, meaning they're suddenly doing their job. The local government is suddenly, it seems to be the case, telling the local police, hey, you can do your job now, because in a lot of other places, they've been really tying police officers' hands behind their backs, telling them, they might get sued, they might get into trouble if they enforce the law. And so a lot of police officers have been wary about doing so lately. Going into this a bit more, they said this, right? It's unclear if the heightened police presence was due to the letter or due to the general spike in crime and homicides, although we can say that there's an interesting alignment that they suddenly set up shop right in the area where these businesses threatening to cut their taxes are. Now, this is according to the letter. It says, what is happening in our front yard, the chaos and lawlessness that escalated this weekend into another night of tragic, unspeakable gun violence, has been going on for far too long. And again, the business owners who signed the letter want the city to enforce traffic and parking laws, pick up trash, stop the open-air drug sales, and allow police to enforce laws. Sounds like New York. Now, they said the trash that piles up every week drives into the inner harbor and hurts the environment, attracts rodents and fosters disease, and stinks up the street and damages the beauty of our wonderful waterfront community, they wrote. If nothing is done, the businesses said that the, quote, undersigned parties are prepared to withhold our city taxes and minor privilege and permit fees and place those funds into escrow account, which will not release until and unless basic and essential municipal services are restored. Now, folks, pay attention. This seems to be what got the local government to actually start doing something interesting. Now, the biggest part with this will be whether other businesses do this. Now, remember, we can look at how unions in the United States have turned out, right? The unions themselves have kind of become monolithic organizations that in some instances actually, I'd say in some instances, replicate the very problems they were trying to solve, right? They become hierarchical organizations that don't always represent the interests of their constituents, organizations that force people sometimes to actually pay into them, even if they don't want to, and that strong-arm businesses and small business owners into having people join their unions. They work like a mafia in some places. But the old unions, what people often think of when they think of unions, were people joining together and saying, we're going to hold a general strike unless you start treating us like basic human beings. We're going to hold a general strike unless you give us these basic services. And it's interesting to see now that this union type structure, what unions used to be, is actually forming among businesses that don't believe the local government is actually using their tax money in ways that, well, do anything of benefit for them. They're again seeing violence. They're seeing police, talks of defunding the police. They're seeing attacks on, well, regular people in their communities. I mean, New York is becoming pretty bad also. And they're basically telling local government that, look, if you don't start giving us the basic services that our tax dollars are supposed to be paying for, we're not going to pay our taxes. And their approach with this is interesting too. They're not necessarily saying they're going to stop paying taxes. They're saying they're going to withhold the taxes and place the taxes they would be paying in an account separate that they will not release until the local government starts actually using the tax dollars in ways that, well, reflects what they claim tax money is normally for. Interesting incident, folks. We'll have to watch this develops. And the biggest thing to watch for with this will be whether businesses in other areas do something similar. Sorry, people don't like the union comparison, Robbie Pierce. Yeah, and I know it's a bit different. I understand. But it is interesting watching how businesses are taking care of this. How about this? Closer to what the founding fathers said, where they talked about taxation without representation, and they threatened to actually overthrow the local government unless the British king at that time started providing representation, right? In addition to the taxes they were collecting. Remember, folks, taxation without representation is one of the most basic reasons why the American system was formed. So, cheers to that, right? Drink tonight, by the way, is Sencha green tea. Now, folks, another story here talking about wondering where your money's going. Black Lives Matter is wondering now where the heck their money's been going. And there's infighting now within the movement, especially when it comes to holding founders of the movement accountable, who seem to have been using donations to the organization that they thought were going to be, fighting for Black rights and things like this, and buying mansions, it seems to be the case. Now, let's go into what's happening. Now, it says here, Black Lives Matter infighting grows. Members demand accountability from the co-founder. And they're saying here, infighting among different Black Lives Matter groups appears to be increasing after a coalition of Black Lives Matter chapters demanded transparency from the group's global network amid reports that co-founder Patrisse Cullors spent millions of dollars on homes and real estate. Now, Cullors, a self-described trained Marxist, stepped down from the group last month, but denied allegations that she misused any donations and said those claims, along with reports about her real estate holdings, were part of a right-wing misinformation campaign meant to discredit Black Lives Matter and her. So, according to her, the individuals within Black Lives Matter, it seems, who are wondering why she's buying multi-million-dollar homes, allegedly, and buying real estate, when it seems to be the case that her money is coming from Black Lives Matter, the organization, that those individuals within Black Lives Matter are now part of the right wing, and they're spreading misinformation. Now, but a group calling itself BLM 10 Plus, the name of the 10 original Black Lives Matter signatories, said it wants answers from the BLM Global Network, Cullors, and others about how donations were spent, alleging the leftist organization's leadership hasn't been transparent with the other groups. Now, there have been actually many people within the Black Lives Matter movement who have distanced themselves from the movement, withdrawn from the movement, or begun kind of forming factions within it. And a lot of this has been about them claiming that the new organization of the movement, BLM Global Network, seems to have transformed into something they didn't anticipate. Many people have criticized it for not actually representing things that, say, benefit the Black communities. It seems to be the case, again, that they're working for things like, trained Marxist movements, right? One of the statements they had on their website was destroying the nuclear family. And when people noticed that Black Lives Matter was pushing for the destruction of the nuclear family, they deleted that from their website. Why would a group looking to solve problems within the Black communities want to dissolve or destroy the nuclear family, when, again, fatherlessness is one of the biggest problems of gang crime and other things like this? A lot of the problems you have, a lot of it starts with fatherlessness. Check out some of the interviews with Larry Elder that we have on Epoch TV, actually. Fatherlessness is one of the biggest problems. Why would they want to destroy the nuclear family? Maybe it's because they don't have the interests of the local community in mind. Maybe it's because they have broader political interests at heart. And it seems to be the case of those broader political interests, like being trained Marxists, working for Marxist agendas, is the real maybe reason they're doing a lot of this. Now, remember a bit of what was happening when information on Black Lives Matter was coming out early on when it came to its finances. It seemed to be the case that one of the organizations the money was going to was to some Democrat-led organization that was giving money to many different things, including, for example, Democrat political campaigns. A lot of people criticized BLM during the elections as being basically a laundering fund or a slush fund that was giving money basically to Democrat candidates, Biden and others. And people were pointing out that, well, they think they're giving their money for racial justice issues, when in reality it seemed to be the case. It was more like a Democrat fundraising campaign. You also had the issue, for example, where one of the networks within BLM was, if you clicked on the donation bar, actually took you to a Chinese front organization. That front organization was one of the Chinese Tongs, one of the fraternal organizations that just so happened to have been started tied to the Red Guard of the Chinese Communist Party here in the United States, a group that was working as a CCP, Chinese Communist Party front operation. Now, the funny thing with that part of the story, right, was that the New York Times actually came out of left field and tried to debunk it and claimed they debunked it, when in reality, all they did was said, oh, well, you're criticizing this Chinese front organization of being a Chinese front organization, when in reality, the information you're quoting from is from a different organization. Now, the reality of that is that these two organizations were branches of the same parent organization. They were branches of the same organization. It's like saying, you're criticizing the local Goodwill when, you're quoting from the Goodwill in like New Jersey or something like that. That's kind of how they're doing this, right? It was nonsense. In other words, you had money from Black Lives Matter getting funneled to Chinese front organizations during the election. Many issues like that, folks. And it'll be interesting because the main push for investigation is specifically about the way the co-founder is spending money. Again, buying mansions and so on. And we'll have to see whether the money from Black Lives Matter was used for that. But their calls for where the finances are going broadly may touch on these other very controversial issues. Controversial issues that are very likely the larger network does not want investigated. Now, let's go into a few other stories, folks. And again, around the halfway point, we'll go into some questions. So if you have questions, leave them in the chat. Another story here. I want to talk about what's happening right now with China and G7, because you just had this big G7 meeting. The United States and other G7 members are talking about kind of the strategy going forward. And it's interesting to watch how things are going because right now you have the United States and the G7 powers really going strong against the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the big questions right now is how will Russia and other countries really within that network position themselves? A few stories here to go into, folks, because it's getting interesting, to put it lightly. It says here, U.S., UK sign new Atlantic Charter, setting focus on Red China. And folks, those of you who know what the Atlantic Charter is, this ties back to World War II. They're using the basis of an agreement that was formed around countering the Nazi Party. It seems to be the case to counter the Chinese Communist Party, which actually says a lot now about how the CCP is positioning itself strategically on the world stage. It says here, the United States President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson signed a new Atlantic Charter on the eve of the G7 summit in the United Kingdom. The agreement and the related joint statement by the two heads of state set focused on communist China. On June 10th, Biden and Johnson signed the agreement that is modeled after the 1941 Atlantic Charter signed by then U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and a pledge to cooperate on peace and democracy when Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party was invading the European continent. Now, the interesting part is they're actually using the same name as this charter, the Atlantic Charter. Now, the new charter will now see the Allies cooperate again to face the expansion of socialism with Chinese characteristics as Beijing continues to challenge the international liberal democratic rules-based order. And they said, quote, in the statement, our revitalized Atlantic Charter, building on the commitments and aspirations set out 80 years ago, affirms our ongoing commitment to sustaining our enduring values and defending them against new and old challenges. They said, we commit to working closely with all partners to share our democratic values and to countering the efforts of those who seek to undermine our alliances and institutions. Now, as was the case with the 1941 statements, again, right before World War II, the new Atlantic Charter outlines eight key areas in which the United States and the United Kingdom have pledged to collaborate. They include defending the principles, values, and institutions of democracy and open societies and human rights, freedom of navigation and lawful use of the seas, and a commitment to open and fair trade between nations. Environmental and health stewardship were also mentioned among the 8 commitments. The document did not mention Communist China by name, but it's clear that the commitments in the charter outline how the two countries intend to together face the threats posed by Beijing. In other words, the wording of it is very much geared towards China. The commitments regarding human rights, rule of law, free press, free trade, freedom of navigation, importantly because of South China Sea, and protecting the liberal West's innovative edge in science and technology directly address the Chinese regime's ongoing encroachment of freedoms in Hong Kong, genocide against Uyghurs in Xinjiang, as well as its increasing military aggression in the disputed South China Sea, setting up debt traps for nations involved in its Belt and Road initiatives, and systematic stealing of others' intellectual property, among many other things. Now, as a quick note with this, in addition to this, G7 rivals China, again with a grand infrastructure plan. Take this for what it's worth, folks. Remember the Biden administration's talking about this new infrastructure plan? It seems to be the case now that they're working with Republicans, and Republicans do seem to be on board with an agreement now. One that's not, the $1.6 trillion spending package the Democrats want, but it's, still close to $1 trillion. Now, with that, the way that they were trying to push that through is they wanted to create a global minimum tax, right? They want to have global corporate tax, global corporate minimum tax, as a way to make sure that businesses that are being taxed because they want to use the taxes to pay for this new spending bill for infrastructure, they want to ensure that businesses don't just leave the United States and go to some other country. So they're creating this alignment with pretty much any US-friendly country, this agreement, again, of a global minimum corporate tax rate. Now, China is going to be a huge thorn in the side of that, because the Chinese Communist Party would very likely not follow that, because cheap manufacturing, cheap business is one of the ways the CCP lures businesses into China to do that type of thing. In other words, the chances of them being able to work with China and that are very slim. An important part on this as well, this model infrastructure, now it's kind of a bipartisan issue here in the United States. The big question is what constitutes infrastructure? That's kind of where the argument is, and also how do you pay for it? A lot of Republicans don't want tax hikes to pay for something like this. But in China, under the Chinese Communist Party, this is one of the main ways that the CCP, under their state capitalist, i.e. socialist model, tend to pay for things like this, tend to reinvigorate their economy, I should say. In China, you call them mega projects. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of it. In China, they have ghost cities. Entire cities that nobody lives in, empty, like huge skyscrapers. Nobody lives in them. They call them ghost cities. You have airports that nobody uses. You have freeways going into the middle of nowhere. Airports in the middle of nowhere, stuff like that. Mega projects, things that cost a ton of money. The local governments usually get into debt paying for them, but they keep people working. Their local jobs. Local officials tend to embezzle a whole lot of money through it, so local officials get rich through these projects. Sometimes they're what they call tofu buildings, meaning you can break the brick with between your finger and your thumb. I'm sure you've seen the tofu building memes, maybe. This is one of the big issues that came about in the Xinjiang earthquake, where you had buildings collapse in Xinjiang, China, and locals were pointing out that these buildings were so brittle that you can break the bricks with your fingers. And again, the problem was that local officials were embezzling the money from them, making themselves rich, stealing money from the projects. Now, in China, this is one of the main ways that local officials make a whole lot of money, embezzle finances. This is how they keep local businesses running, doing these mega projects. This is how they keep money circulating internally within the economy. If done well, there's a certain benefit to doing it when the government, again, makes these infrastructure projects, because it creates local jobs and it recycles the taxpayer finances within the local economy by creating jobs and so on. The big question is, do you create local jobs with it, or do you hire foreign firms to do it? Like, for example, Trump's border wall, you could say, was a mega project. And again, it was U.S. steel, U.S. companies building it and so on, right? It created local jobs. That's how he promoted it. CCP does this as kind of a corruption mechanism. Even the One Belt, One Road initiative, where they're going into other countries and doing that, is kind of an extension of that. Now, the U.S. is planning on doing some of this stuff as well. And this talk again around this global infrastructure plan is interesting because they're pushing this now as a solution to push back against the CCP by, to an extent, adopting some of the, say, models of the CCP. We'll have to see how they actually play it out, while at the same time challenging the CCP through this pushback economically. It'll be interesting to watch, to say the least. And the interesting point as well is how they're positioning the CCP as kind of a real global threat, which I would agree with. The CCP is, I'd say, the biggest threat in the world right now. And the ambitions of the CCP are to become the global hegemon. Watching the world unite against it is actually very interesting to watch. Now, another point on this is how the CCP is responding. Epoch Times reports, foreign companies must act at Beijing's behest under new law in China. In other words, folks, if you're a big tech company, if you're a big financial firm and you're doing business in China, you are now acting really as part of the CCP system because of a new law. And this will be very interesting to watch how it plays out. Now, it says here, China passed a new law that orders all individuals and businesses in China to apply sanctions the regime has launched against foreign counterparts. I'll get into why this is a really, really big deal. Let's go in a minute. It also bars companies from complying with foreign restrictions placed on Chinese firms and citizens. Moreover, the law came into effect on June 10th when the regime's rubber-stamped legislature approved it without a third reading, which is a prerequisite under Chinese legislative law. In other words, someone in China pushed this through, bypassing even their normal laws. Now, a US-based China affairs commentator, Tong Jingyuan, said it orders foreign citizens to act against their own homelands and be loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. You hear that, folks? This is making it so that any business working in China has to choose now whether they're loyal to the Chinese Communist Party or whether they're loyal to the free world. Because under this new law, if you're an individual, if you're a business and you're operating in China, you have to enforce the CCP's sanctions. And remember, the Chinese Communist Party has been sanctioning US officials like Mike Pompeo and others. It's been sanctioning European officials, Australian officials, talking about this, at least expanding it. The CCP is trying to place itself as being the world leader. They're pretending that they're already there. At least they think they're there, it seems. And they're trying to now make Western companies operating in China enforce these laws. Now, this is going to put these companies in a very difficult spot because these companies are supposed to enforce U.S. sanctions and sanctions from the free world on Chinese companies. Interestingly, the Biden administration actually even kept in place Trump's sanctions against Chinese military-tied businesses and even expanded the list of them, in fact. In other words, businesses are now caught in the middle. Not just businesses, even individuals are caught in the middle. They have a choice. Do they enforce the CCP's sanctions or do they enforce the free world sanctions? And if they enforce the CCP's sanctions, this is going to cause a whole lot of very wild, probably lawsuits and other issues in any country outside of China. Get ready for the sparks to fly, folks. This is a very, very interesting development. And keep this in mind. Keep this in the context of the United States and the UK just passing this Atlantic Treaty Charter that is modeled after what they did to the Nazis ahead of World War II. Keep this in this context, folks, the way this is positioning itself, because it's not showing signs of becoming a war like we would normally think of it. But this is the world now engaging the Chinese Communist Party within the warfare battleground, we could say, that the CCP has already established using unconventional means. Economic warfare, business warfare, sanction warfare, environmental warfare, culture warfare, things that they talk about as warfare, and things that Xi Jinping himself declares when he gives his public talks, saying we are at war with the United States, saying the United States is our number one enemy. This war now is being met to an extent, it seems, by the free world. And while this happens, the businesses that have sold themselves to China to some extent, and the financial institutions, even more interestingly, like global banks and so on, are going to have to choose a side. Yeah, EBB, biowarfare, an important one as well. Folks, this is developing in a very interesting direction, and one which we should really be paying close attention to, and I'll be keeping you all updated on. Now, I won't go too much further into this, but one more part on this. Another quote here, this is from Li Hengqing, a scholar at the Washington Institute for Information and Strategy, told this to the Epoch Times. He said, the timing is key. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, passed the law, this one, on businesses right after President Joe Biden started his Europe trip. In other words, this is in that context. Again, Biden will talk with European leaders about the investigation into the origin of the CCP virus, which likely leaked from the Wuhan lab. Now, folks, what is one of the key parts with the investigation possibly into the origin of the virus? It's if either they prove it came from this Wuhan laboratory, or they prove that the CCP is not allowing them to investigate it. You have Dr. Fauci and Mark Zuckerberg and all kinds of other folks wrapped up in that whole scandal. The way this develops, they might be holding the Chinese Communist Party accountable to pay reparations to the entire world through sanctions or tariffs. And the CCP now is making a law directly as it relates to sanctions and probably tariffs, that businesses have to side with it, not with the free world. The CCP is drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is where you are. You choose your allegiance. This is where things are at now. Now, I won't go too much more into this, but one quick note on this, and we'll jump into some questions as this happens as well. Texas is talking about banning the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, from owning land in the United States. Might not know, folks, but foreign countries, including the Chinese Communist Party, actually own a whole lot of land in the United States. There was a China-based energy company that bought more than 130,000 acres in Texas near an Air Force base that's now trying to build a wind farm to gain access to the U.S. electrical grid. There's some really wild stuff happening. Now, we won't go too deep into this, folks. Let's go into some questions, though, because we're about the halfway point and want to jump into them. So again, folks, you have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. And in about 15 minutes, we'll jump to Epoch TV, and there's some updates on what's happening with the election investigations. Actually, some very big stuff, folks. So again, we'll go into questions now, then we'll do the election investigation stories on Epoch TV where we can't be censored. All right, folks, go to the first question for the night. But first, I'll show you a quick preview of what we're working on over at Epoch TV, because as I mentioned, we are totally demonetized by YouTube. So we don't have super chat. That's why we don't have advertisers. Again, if you want to support this channel, folks, epochtv.com/crossroads. That's our uncensored platform. It's one where we can post a lot of exclusive content. It's one that they can't do anything to stop us on if you want to speak the truth. So please check it out. epochtv.com/crossroads. I'll show you a quick preview of what we're working on there right now. Stay informed and stay free.
Let us tell your story.
Facts always matter.
Hearing from everyone, from newsmakers to people just like you.
Deep dive interviews that challenge assumptions.
Bringing fast, compelling, first-hand news from China.
All right, folks. Again, that's epochtv.com/crossroads. Please check it out. Again, if you want to support this channel, that's how we're supporting ourselves now. And so if you want to keep this channel, help us keep this channel going, please check it out, folks. Again, it really helps us. And I think we have some great content there as well. We have a lot of shows. We're trying to bring more on. Really, I think you'll all like it. Now, that said, before I go into questions, I just want to go over quick headlines with you, because this China story is actually very big. At the same time all this stuff's happening with China, here are just a few headlines. Biden, Putin right that U.S.-Russian relations are at lowest point in recent history. Biden reveals why he won't join a press conference with Putin. And folks, also the G7 is demanding action from Russia on cyber crimes and chemical weapons use. And Biden also announced $150 million in defense aid to Ukraine amid its conflict with Russia. In other words, you have alliances forming, folks. China, Russia, probably North Korea, probably Iran, and then a handful of other countries throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia. That's one alliance that is forming. The other main alliance is G7 nations, the United States, Canada to some extent, UK, most of Europe, Japan, Australia, India, and a few others. It's very interesting to watch how this is turning out, folks. A lot going on right now. And again, there's international alliances forming right now, very tense ones. Now, we'll see how they work. I would argue partly that modern warfare, when it comes to how we should be viewing it and how the CCP and Russia view it, really develops mostly in the unconventional realm. Economic warfare, business warfare, sanction warfare, things like this. But if it reaches a certain degree where, let's say, things break down and where the only path forward for a certain nation, like a cornered rat or something like that, is to engage in direct action, then that may be the case. And as a country like the Chinese Communist Party, where you have, 30 million young men who will never get married, the interest of the CCP to, maybe get rid of some people who they see as threats to the stability of the system is not that hard to imagine, folks. Now, I'll keep you all updated on this as we go forward because there's a lot going on. Let's go into some questions now. All right, so first question here, let's see. This is from... no name. It says, Josh, how do you suppose states like New Jersey, New York, and California will make up for the lost tax revenue after families such as mine leave blue states for red ones, bringing our taxable income with us? Well, that's actually a great question. I don't have the numbers in front of me. There's been a few nights where I wanted to go over the story. Folks, you have blue states like California, like New York, like others, losing billions upon billions upon billions of dollars because business owners are going out of business, because people are leaving the state for Texas and Arizona and New Jersey, maybe, and other places. New Jersey's having a hard time too, and other places. And folks, they're bringing their tax dollars with them. They're going to Florida, they're going to other places. Now, as this happens, these states are very likely going to have a lot of trouble with finances. Now, New York and California looked like they weren't going to be doing so hot with it. Now, by the way, tea tonight. They looked like they weren't going to be doing so hot even this year. In fact, I was anticipating that because of the tax problems they were going to be having, they were going to have to start cutting back on government spending. And some states are in really dire straits. In New York, you have the payments they have to make to the unions so high that they can't even negotiate them. You have so much pensions and so much money going to the unions that if they were just to pay the unions and pay the pensions, almost no tax money would be left in the first place. And so they keep deferring it with debt and things like this. On top of that, you have massive government spending. In New York, if you're an illegal alien, you get free health care. Things like this. They have other programs giving free housing to homeless people, sometimes hotel rooms and things like this. They're emptying out the prisons, and this is causing a lot of weight on the local police departments. You could argue that maybe the police departments don't have the weight of paying for that, but a lot of times it's contracts. They have to keep the same payments there anyways. Folks, it's not looking so hot. Now, in my opinion, my analysis, this was becoming a bubble. This was becoming a bubble that there wasn't any real clear solution to, other than different states basically, maybe going bankrupt and then dealing with the fact that their spending was out of control and having to re-budget, let's say, in ways that have responsible spending and in ways that really probably cut back on a lot of socialist programs, because a lot of the money goes to socialist programs that tend to create, crime states in bad areas. It's why if you look at states that have the most, or cities that have the most socialist policies, the state of the conditions of the people tend to be a lot worse. Free money is not something that typically pulls people out of poverty. Free money typically ingrains people in poverty. It institutionalizes poverty. You also have the issue as well of the corrupt loan system, the corrupt debt system, where because of organizations like the Federal Reserve, people don't really have to be able to pay off their debts to get loans. You have people in lifelong debt because, if the banks, go bust, if there's a run on the bank, the Federal Reserve bails them out using inflation as a hidden tax to steal your money out of the bank by siphoning it out of the tangible value of your money, right? That's how inflation works. And it's a big corrupt system, frankly. Now, they were at the brink of having to deal with these problems, actually deal with these problems, which would have very likely included doing away with many programs that actually don't benefit people. What did we see? They put through this program, again, these, COVID bailouts, where most of the money actually didn't go to taxpayers or people, looking to deal with the virus, that they were out of work and so on, because that was how it was pitched. Remember, folks, again, when you had talk, when Trump was still president, people were criticizing him, saying, why won't you sign this COVID bailout bill? Families are starving. People are out of work. The American people need money. And they were, singing this big whole sad song about how the American people were being, starving to death and so on. They passed the bill, over $1 trillion, 1.6 trillion, something crazy like that. Most of the money doesn't even go to Americans. Most of the money goes to like other countries and local governments and bailing out corrupt business and things like this. They did it a couple times, in fact. All right. While they gave a little, hand-me-down, here's your loaf of bread, Marie Antoinette style, handout to the American people. Here's your piece of bread, peasant, enjoy. After they did that, right? One of the things they did was they not only bailed out some of these big businesses that were having a lot of financial troubles, big businesses, while the small businesses were still going out of business and are facing issues like we discussed earlier, local taxes not really being used in ways that benefit communities. Not only did they do that, but they even bailed out some of the states, some of the cities like New York. And so a lot of states that really were in dire straits, not being able to pay off these loans and having all these problems, got bailed out. Again, under the veil, under the Trojan horse of, again, this virus bailout. The virus bailout was used as the excuse to do that. And so you're asking, what are states like this supposed to do now that people are leaving with their money? They're looking for federal bailouts. They want the federal government to pay for them. In other words, you're going to have tax redistribution to failed states because they're socialist policy heavy states, right? Socialist policy heavy states being bailed out by the states that are functional, right? States like Texas and others that actually do well fiscally, the tax money from them is bailing out states that really can't pull their own weight, ones that mainly have socialist policies. That seems to be the case of how they plan on doing it, right? Like federal welfare states. You have your local welfare states. They're turning them into federal welfare states. Is how they're doing it. Next question here. This is from Mary Hensel. Mary Hens, you said, will Fauci be removed, or does Biden have the final say on his position? Isn't what he has done criminal? I was actually thinking about this because there's a lot of pushback right now on Dr. Fauci. Fauci was working under President Trump. He's now working under President Biden. It's interesting because Biden actually criticized Trump's handling of the virus when the policy was coming from Dr. Fauci, and Biden kept Dr. Fauci in. Now you have Dr. Fauci's leaked emails. Really, it seems to be the case, trying to cover up investigations into the origin of the virus, especially as it relates to a possible lab origin in China, specifically because his organization and financing he was aware of was going to pay for in China under the Wuhan Institute of Virology research, specifically on gain of function research, which is where they take viruses and they make them more deadly, more able to infect human cells and so on. They didn't want the research. They didn't want the investigations going there. Now, Dr. Fauci is kind of in a hot, tight spot, right? When it comes to even a lot of the legacy news outlets, a lot of people are attacking Dr. Fauci. I was expecting that Biden would be interested in, kind of throwing Fauci under the bus, frankly, because Fauci was working under Trump and his virus policies, they could blame it on, and they could kind of wipe their hands and say, it was his problem, the problem solved, we're going to do things differently going forward. But even while the mainstream media, legacy media, international organizations, even countries are criticizing this, the Biden administration isn't seeming to take that move. They're not going after Dr. Fauci. In fact, they're defending him. And so it's interesting to watch how this is going forward. Maybe they believe that no actual investigation will inevitably be done into the origins of the virus. even though they're pressing China on it. The chances of China opening its doors and saying, hey guys, come on in, is very, I'd say, slim to none. In fact, I'd say even at this point, were they to even do that, nobody would believe the findings that would come out from it. Even if China were to say, all right, folks, everybody, pack your bags and come visit our virus laboratory, like Willy Wonka or something like that, nobody would trust the findings that come out of it. You'd expect them to have covered things up. You would have expected them to have destroyed evidence right now. And in fact, there's been a lot of evidence that they were destroying evidence already. This is kind of where things are at. And so maybe they believe things will blow over with Dr. Fauci. No actual investigation can be done into the laboratory in China. And maybe they think that challenging the CCP is the best next step. And keeping the focus on the Chinese Communist Party rather than on Dr. Fauci is a better way forward, because the CCP is what's ultimately, say, accountable to this. Although many local officials are also, say, wrapped up in this, Dr. Fauci being one, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook being another, and others, folks. A lot going on with this. Let's do one more question, and then, folks, let's jump over to Epoch TV after this for some updates on what's happening with the election investigations and also what's happening with Trump. This is from Gail Cruz. You said, will other states refuse to pay taxes too? Here in New Orleans, someone stole a guy's truck. The police saw it, gave a chase for 1 block, and stopped. Apparently, a violent crime has not been committed, so they did not pursue the thief. Well, this is a problem you have in a lot of states. In California and in some areas, I mean, if you steal like less than $5,000 of goods, the police can't even do anything about it because of the local laws. If you, let's say, have no moral compass and you want to take advantage of that, you walk into your local store and you bring your backpack and you stuff it full of $4,000 worth of stolen goods. They can't do anything about it. How can local businesses survive if theft up to what is for local businesses, maybe their monthly profit sometimes? How can they possibly survive? Again, if there's nothing in place to stop that from happening. And the ability of local businesses to say, hey, we're going to join together and we're going to say we're not going to pay taxes until you deal with this problem. My local mayor or governor, maybe they will do it. I think the big question will be whether they see this news, because I doubt a lot of media will even cover it. And also whether they decide to do something so drastic. It is a very drastic move because they're risking incriminating themselves by doing that. Although in a way that would very likely, if they were to go after them, make it a bigger story and possibly make an even bigger problem for the local governments. So there's mixed incentive with it, I would say. But I would say the chances of local businesses doing this, if they hear about it and they see it as a possibility, especially if they themselves are risking going out of business already because of bad local policy, they might consider it. Especially businesses that are already in dire straits from the virus, lockdowns, and from other things. They might consider it, folks. All right, folks, that said, it's 11:20, a bit later than usual. So let's jump over to Epoch TV exclusively now, and we're going to go over what's happening with the election integrity investigations, what's happening in Pennsylvania, because there's actually some big updates in Pennsylvania, and also what's happening with Trump. So, folks, again, epochtv.com/crossroads. Check out the links in the description and the links in the live chat. And we'll jump over there now to do the rest of the show. And again, folks, I'll show you a quick preview of what we're working on over there.
Stay informed and stay free.
Let us tell your story.
Facts always matter.
Hearing from everyone, from newsmakers to people just like you.
Deep dive interviews that challenge assumptions.
Bringing fast, compelling, first-hand news from China.